Okay, Amy, tell us a bit about yourself and also how have you got to where you are today?
So I qualified as a primary school teacher. So I'd always been quite interested in education. My mum was head of school at primary, my sister's a primary school teacher. And so I went into primary teaching in terms of qualification. And as I was getting towards the end of my time at Durham, I became really interested in children's books. I think it merged together my interest in education and English literature that I liked at school. And so I started to do a little bit of research about children's books and ended up doing my final year dissertation on kind of classic texts and how teachers were using those in the classroom in terms of if children could still access the language, if they still liked these books. And as I was coming to the end of my degree, I kind of wasn't ready to leave academia yet. And Cambridge had a really good host of master's programs, and they had one in children's literature, which seemed fantastic. So I went and did that. Again, it was only meant to be a year before I went back into primary teaching. And then I loved the research community. I loved the topics. I got on really well with my supervisor. And so I ended up putting in an application for kind of a PhD to particularly look at children's classics that Cambridge funded. So I then did kind of another 5 years looking at children's classics. I got interested in an approach that was about quantifying literature and looking at how we can study lots of examples of something. And I never quite fell into series. It was more, the more that I studied children's classics, I saw that they kept being produced in series. And I became interested about when you put something in a series, there's lots of publishing decisions and there's lots of marketing, and how does that impact on the experience of a text? And then when I finished up around the time of the pandemic, I got a job up here at BGU, which really intersected with my interests because I work in education studies, but there's also an overlap with English. So I teach on MA programs, including our MA in Children's Literature and Literacies, and there's a really good research group at BGU with lots of like-minded people working in literature and literacies.
Are you doing any research at the moment?
Yes, so I'm currently working on turning my PhD into a book, so to appear in Bloomsbury's series of perspectives on children's literature. So that's been interesting, revisiting the work that I did as a kind of a PhD student, doing some updating, particularly to data that had stopped around 2017 and looking at what's happened to the children's classics since, and also engaging with what other people have written in that period. Alongside that, I've kind of taken aspects of my work to develop a little bit more. So recently I presented at a conference about diversity in children's literature. So I was looking at diversity aspects of the children's classics, and I'm also working on a journal article about the methodological approach that in terms of how children's literature can be studied through distant reading methods.
So what do you mean by diversity in that context?
So in that context, there's a lot of people working on diversity in children's literature. And mine was particularly when we talk about children's classics, diversity in terms of the authorship. And actually, a lot of these books that are recommended, we think of children's classics as the best books. But diversity-wise, there's a dominance of works by male authors, by white British authors, and from around the kind of late 19th century into the 20th century. So there's a limited kind of access of those books for children, and there's a limited measure of diversity. Diversity can also appear in terms of covers. Some publishers have been trying to diversify classics through using covers that, for example, depict a character from a different ethnicity in a different way. And so the marketing aspect comes in as well. But I was predominantly interested in really books that are being recommended. Are they diverse? Can all children see themselves in what's being kind of recommended today?
Okay, so one of the main theme that we agreed to talk about today is about the commodification of childhood.
Yeah.
Could you just give us an overview of what do we need to know about that particular topic?
Okay, so it's a hugely broad one, commodification of childhood. So my lens is to look at it particularly in relation to children's literature and drilling down within that kind of children's classics. But it's the idea that actually traditionally childhood has been thought of in a romantic sense as something that's quite pure, that's not contaminated, kind of very natural as well. But actually, as we've gone through history and we see this reaching its kind of peak now, currently in the 21st century, childhood is actually becoming kind of a range of products it's becoming things to be consumed and things to be bought as well. So that can range from films to toys to games. Kind of, there's now a price, if it were, on aspects of childhood. And that creates a bit of a tension with that traditional romantic notion of childhood as kind of intrinsically good, because now it's something that's got a price and that can kind of be exchanged and bought as well. And you see this in the proliferation of goods that are out there. If you were to walk into a children's bookshop, if you were to kind of go into a shop anywhere, you're going to see a range of products associated with childhood. So that can be bought, that it can be exchanged. And so that's kind of in our collective consciousness now, that childhood is linked to stuff, and that stuff has a price.
What do you think to that idea of, the children as consumers?
It's really interesting, because obviously your instinctive response is to say, okay, well, that's not great. That's not great that actually this is becoming more contaminated. Childhood's becoming influenced hugely by huge conglomerates, kind of corporations and companies that are producing these products as well. But there is sort of a flip side to that. Positioning children as consumers does allow them some power. Actually allows them a voice. Kind of, it encourages maybe the proliferation of items that are acceptable to them, that are kind of deemed as something that they would like as well. So we are putting the child still at the forefront of this and giving them some power. And actually, in the context of children's literature, it's led to kind of a huge growth in that area, because previously children's imprints were actually one small part in the 20th century of big publishing houses, and now they're houses in themselves, kind of, and it's spread to the extent that there's a whole range of items and products that children might be interested in. So there's kind of two ways to look at it. One way that it's kind of, it could be seen as damaging, the other way that it actually allows children some power and agency. But obviously their involvement in all these goods is quite limited. So children aren't creating the goods that we see in shops, but they're marketed at them. So it's a view of a child consumer rather than the child actually having their voice fully heard, maybe.
So when it comes to those two different sides of the spectrum, whereabouts do you think we are right now in terms of, like, are we heading towards children having more power, or are we heading towards more just the fact that everything is being a bit more sort of commercialized, and children are just seen as consumers rather than having any sort of real agency in determining what's going on?
I think it's probably, given, my opinion would be that given the kind of proliferation of goods that are out there, it's probably more towards the idea that kind of consumerism is dominating as well. And there's lots of different kind of versions of maybe what adults think children want that dominates kind of quite a bit, because actually there's increasingly number of kind of stakeholders and gatekeepers involved in things like children's literature and children's film as well. So, for example, in the case of children's literature, for a book to get to a child, often it's edited by an adult author, written by an adult author, kind of purchased by a librarian, educator, or a parent. So actually children now take on more role of a receiver maybe rather than a creator, even though those things are marketed at them. But saying that, there is an element of dual address in a lot of these products. They can be aimed at both parents and children because of the financial power that parents possess. Obviously, they literally control the purse strings a lot of the time. And so you see instances, particularly Harry Potter's a good one, that a lot of children's literature scholars discuss as kind of a crossover phenomenon in terms of it's aimed both at adults and children. And I was in York recently, I went into one of the Harry Potter shops, and the majority of people in there were adults actually engaging with the goods and kind of and purchasing those.
How different do you see that sector and education in the more kind of like formal sense? So, you talked about children being the receivers of this kind of the literature that they come across, rather than being a creator. But then I can kind of see a parallel between that and what they engage with in terms of formal education.
Okay, so there is obviously some parallels to be drawn in terms of their role and agency that they have, particularly in formal education, where the setup is that the traditional pedagogical approach is the teacher as the transmitter and the child as the receiver. And you see that quite a lot, particularly in secondary education. I mean, something that actually I discussed with my education students quite recently is a newer approach called pedagogy, which is interesting because it's all about the agency of the child and allowing them to have a greater say. So there are some kind of maybe not subversive, but alternative approaches to education that align with having a child having more agency. But the majority of the traditional pedagogical approaches are still very adult dominated and kind of directed as well. And that really kind of links into how, even when we study education studies and children's literature, the majority of the actors in there are adults. And there's kind of an interesting point about, in relation to children's literature, it's got an apostrophe which implies ownership, but actually that literature isn't really owned as much by children. It's owned by the kind of adult publishers, authors, librarians, educators, kind of politicians who advocate for certain books.
That's really interesting. I'm just thinking in terms of if children were to have more agency, what would that look like?
Exactly, because maybe at the extreme, it looks like children producing the literature that is for them. Kind of maybe that's what at the extreme children's literature and children's film and children's toys look like. But actually in the context of books, because these books are often used for a particular aim, let's say, children's literature is seen as something that can improve children, that can educate them about life, about language as well. So maybe that's something around the hesitancy to allow kind of children who are still formulating in their knowledge in those areas to take full control over those. Because if children's literature is seen as a pedagogical tool, as something that can teach children about it, then what becomes important is the standard of, let's say, the content and the language that's being used too.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, it sounds very interesting to have children having more ownership and more agency to sort of shape what literature could look like. But then naturally, you would think there's going to be a limitation of how much they can actually get involved, because I suppose sort of like, if you think about a child would probably not be able to, write a book, or to be able to really construct something that is big enough to become something that could be published widely. What do you think to that?
So I think it's more about how in this instance we're conceiving of books, because children do write. They write stories. They're in their play. You see that they've kind of got hugely developed narratives. It's just in the formal sense of what we now mean by a book. That's very different. And you see broader educational approaches that we teach our students about here, like Reggio Emilia, where they take children's drawings and they take children's kind of stories and they put them in books and they publish them and see them as and see the children's as artists and authors as well. But within the kind of publishing sphere, we've got quite a kind of formalized product of a book that's gone through different iterations, and that kind of now actually testifies to the fact that most publishing firms are run by business directors and marketers that take precedence actually over in the 1960s and 70s, where even firms like Puffin, the editors had much more power to select books that they liked and wanted to produce, as opposed to having to always justify what would sell or what would be seen as kind of a good book.
I guess if I was to try to be controversial here, is it still relevant even? Because I suppose children nowadays increasingly engaging with more things like social media or web-based content. When it comes to content creation, most people talk about YouTube, or like Instagram and things like that. And this is the world that, children are basically brought up in. And so when it comes to them creating content, which a lot of children are doing, which we're seeing on places like YouTube, do you feel like that side of creation is going to be more relevant to children rather than books?
Well, there's different aspects you can kind of really evaluate things on depending on relevancy. In terms of content creation, I think it's much more open and accessible as a means in terms of kind of tools and kind of the different platforms and kind of how children can very easily get involved with things and are recipients of that. You know, I'll staunchly argue that there's still a very important place for books and reading, and it doesn't have to be an either or. You see kind of books being transformed into film adaptations, into kind of e-text, into kind of videos and animations and apps as well, that allow a lot of the visual aspects. Kind of that's really important for developing a sense of multimodality, of being able to combine modes, being able to be creative and inventive. But at the same time, kind of an aesthetic level, what books give you is often a kind of appreciation of characterization and setting and narrative and plot as well. So they can work in tandem with each other. Kind of they allow for different opportunities, but an experience of both, I think, combines the strengths of each medium.
Okay, just to get into that a bit more, what do you see as something that books can offer children that other formats wouldn't be able to?
So I think, you know, at quite a linguistic level, it's kind of the appreciation of how language can be used and the power of language as well, and kind of the transformative power, how obviously you can visually take someone to a world in a film, but you can also create that world through words as well. And so the more experience children have of different books, the more ways they get to learn of how authors use language, and the fact that there isn't always one right way to use it. And that's quite interesting, because if you were to look at the current national curriculum, there's a lot about correct and accurate usage of grammar and punctuation and spelling. And then you look at children's authors from Roald Dahl all the way through to kind of Alice in Wonderland, particularly Lewis Carroll was very good at this. And they use language in really weird and wonderful ways. They use punctuation in actually weird and wonderful ways too. So it's kind of that appreciation of language. And it also, there's a strong link that's been established between reading and writing. That the more you read, the more you understand words and how authors use words. It makes you a better writer as well, because you internalize that and you can draw on your bank of knowledge about how kind of readers read to kind of write it yourself as a writer for someone else to interpret as well.
Okay, so what do you see as the biggest challenge in that field of children literature? You know, in terms of what we've spoken about up to this point, are there any particular aspects of, you know, this kind of commodification of childhood topic that you see as something that you find difficult?
Well, I think there's still a way, it's still kind of important to be able to engage children with books. That is a challenge to acknowledge. There's a lot of other mediums that are present and are exciting and kind of very kind of multimodal as well. There's lots of them kind of produced kind of constantly. So it's still being able to interest children in books. But I think one thing that's challenging is really the scale of things in the 21st century, kind of the scale of the number of products that are consistently being produced. You know, as we come towards Christmas, that kind of takes on a form as well, kind of the importance of stuff as well. And therefore it's about how to navigate that world. For example, in the range of books, when there are so many new items being constantly produced, it can be challenging to identify. Kind of, I use the term a good book. That's very subjective because it means good for who and for what purpose. But how do you kind of identify what are maybe examples of books that would really benefit and enrich children, and what are kind of maybe less good examples of that? And so it's trying to navigate the kind of mass of kind of products that's out there and differentiate, as I said, between kind of maybe literary items and what are items that are actually connected to a brand. So branding is hugely important, and big brands and characters have spawned a whole related range of products that kind of maybe that makes the water a little more murky, because it might be a product, but it's not necessarily kind of an educational tool.
But if you're thinking about, you know, being able to identify what you said, a good book, but having a bigger range, isn't it better in the sense of there would be more to choose from? You would have a more, I suppose, like a more holistic kind of approach to seeing what there is out there, and so you can see more, so you can compare, you know, in a more effective way, and so you would end up with, I suppose, you know, children potentially having access to better products.
Yeah, so I think we can differentiate between, just because there is a range more doesn't always mean better as well, in terms of that kind of more might give you choice, but maybe it's the quality of that choice within it. For example, there are a lot of series books, and I use it in a different way to series of classics. We're talking about kind of the formulaic ones, where it's more of the same. And this really started to spread towards the kind of end of the 20th century, these kind of mass-produced series, particularly in American context, where each book was sort of followed the same formula, kind of the same characters and repetition that might interest children, but often kind of it's quite formulaic. And so there's criticisms of these books as kind of bland as well. So just because there is a range, so that range doesn't always equal quality. And just because there's a range, that range doesn't always equal representation as well. An ongoing issue in children's literature studies is kind of the issue of diversity that we touched on at the start, in terms of, do books represent children from all backgrounds? Do they represent children from minorities? Do they represent children with kind of disabilities, kind of both of the traditional and neurodivergent version as well? And so that representation isn't always in that mass of books. There might be a lot of books, but often they're aimed at a very similar type of westernized child reader as well.
So who should be able to determine what's good?
Well, this is kind of an ongoing debate. So I deal with classic literature, and part of it is kind of about picking the term classic, and that is tied to a concept of quality. It's like, well, who determines quality as well? And children's literature is quite interesting, because there's a lot of different actors or agents involved that might have contrasting versions of what quality looks like. So maybe for scholars, quality is often determined in terms of the literary aspects, you know, about the quality of the writing and, you know, the characterization and the language that's used. Maybe to educators, quality is if in terms of it teaches children something. Does it teach them important life lessons, or teach them about language as well? And in another educational context, kind of when the curriculum was formulated by Michael Gove, he did a lot of speeches about the classics and positioned them as important for improving literacy, but also reducing social inequality. So in a good books would be those that kind of have good language, that allow children to kind of develop their literacy skills. But then for child readers, the concept of a good book can be very different. Maybe a good book is what makes them laugh. Maybe a good book is kind of what they like to curl up with under the covers. And it's interesting when you see surveys of children's reading, like those done by Topping each year, and the books that children are picking as their favourite books often don't align with all these lists of best books for children to read, publishers' series of classics, what scholars have put in their books, actually. Children often like books that are linked to maybe kind of the adaptations, like I think a lot of it David Walliams books, kind of celebrity authors, books like Harry Potter that are tied to a whole franchise and series of marketing, or books that are very kind of child friendly in their approach. So books like Diary of the Wimpy Kid and Roald Dahl's work that actually aimed very much at the child reader, and the author tries to align themselves with the child reader to create that sense of kinship there.
So would you say it's quite problematic to, I suppose, define what good looks like, or what, you know, what should be seen as classic?
I think it's hugely problematic, because each of these different agents we've said will come from different perspectives, have different motives, and so good and quality means something slightly different for them. And a list of what kind of children's classics might be would look very different to maybe what publishers are putting out there, or what educators say, because they're driven by kind of different motives. For example, when I was exploring classics, one thing that comes out is that often you see these books marketed in bookshops, and they've got the title classic on them. And so you might assume, okay, that's a strictly marker of quality. These are the best books, but actually you unpick that a little more, and what is included in the series of classics can often be down to commercial concerns. If for example, a huge big one is copyright. If copyright has expired in a book, it's more likely to appear in series of classics because publishers can reproduce it without paying royalties. So actually classics change as books come out of copyright and new ones enter. And similarly, sometimes publishers might include a book in a series of classics to raise its sales figures alongside other examples like Alice in Wonderland and The Wind in the Willows. So just because you see titles doesn't always mean that that's a strict reflection of what is widely agreed to be kind of a good quality children's book.
So if it's problematic, isn't the marketization of literature, well, maybe you can argue that it is a good thing because the market can tell you what's good, because depending on, like, how many books you can sell, and that kind of reflects on, how many children are interested in a particular book and potentially enjoy it, and so that they sell more of it.
I think that can be the case, but sometimes you can get books, because of the power dynamics and the role that adults play, you can have books that are actually continually republished, even if they're not widely favoured or read by children, because it's the adult often who buys the books, and sometimes they're influenced, for example, as their nostalgia, their love of that book as a child as well. So just because a book is being bought in a children's section doesn't necessarily equate to that it's popular with children at that time as well. So what you can get is kind of a series of, or collection of books that are continually republished, maybe because adult publishers, adult readers think that these are good examples of a children's book without direct involvement from a child. And at the same time, though, there are shifts in views of maybe what's acceptable and suitable for children. So, for example, I use sometimes the example of my students of water babies, which actually there's a lot of kind of racist examples and language and outdated views in there. And so that had become sanitized quite a lot. And actually now sometimes you won't find a copy of it in children's bookstores anymore. It's kind of one of those texts that's almost died a bit of a slow death. And some children's critics have argued that it's almost beyond recovery, particularly because a lot of the views were central to that book and now so outdated that when you take them out of it, you sort of lose what the story was at the beginning as well. So that's part of it, I think, in terms of what adults think is suitable and appropriate and what they would want children to read, maybe because they read it as a child themselves.
What do you think to that, really? In terms of, do you see it being a risk of taking content out of, the literature world, which can be perceived as, like you said, outdated, because then it means that children won't be exposed to those ideas? And I'm just wondering if you see that as a risk or as something that is positive.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, I think it's more about how some of these books are engaged with, and that this is a big ongoing debate around kind of, should we see books as a product of their time and that they represent the views of that time, and so engage with them in that way, or should we see them in the current context, which is that they don't align with our views, so we shouldn't engage with them at all. And I'd be inclined to say that it's important to share these books, but to contextualize and discuss them. So to kind of lead in with how these books are a product of their time, look at kind of the social and political views at the time that were going on, and how they're present in the book, and compare them to examples today as well. So I think it's about kind of often the skill of the educator in engaging and prompting critical reflection on these books, because they were written at a particular time, but books obviously can be written at one time but received in many time periods since. And a lot of literature we see today, even ones, for example, Alice in Wonderland, reflects a particular view of children and childhood and education, and kind of the relationship between adults and children at that time. So it's kind of interesting in a historical sense, even if it's outdated to what we might think today.
Because I'm just thinking with the idea of wanting to make literature more diverse, it's always going to be very difficult to kind of include values and certain features that you feel like would be suitable for everyone. Because we are dealing with different cultures, we're dealing with different children from different religious backgrounds and so on, and it's quite hard to kind of have a story that doesn't kind of go into certain areas, if you like, that could be a bit controversial for a particular group of people.
And I think actually, I mean, there are some theorists that argue that the presence, for example, of classic books that have outdated views in them, by including those in a series of classics, they act as really a barrier to diversifying things like children's classics, because it's hard to place kind of a more modern and multicultural and open book alongside a book that actually has some very stereotyped and outdated views within it. But it's kind of a challenge to reflect the book, to have books that represent all children's backgrounds. But it's hugely important, because if children can't see themselves in the books that they're encountering, first of all, they might think that reading isn't for people like them, because they don't feel any kind of alignment with what they're seeing in those texts as well. And also it can contribute to their self-worth. I mean, Radine Sims Bishop, who's a theorist, talks about how books can be windows, mirrors and doors. And the mirrors is the idea that you should see your life reflected back in the books. And so an ongoing effort is to make sure that all children have a book as a mirror as well, because sometimes they don't have a mirror, or if there is a mirror, that mirror could be stereotyped or outdated, or it could not be a kind of positive representation of their backgrounds as well.
So what do you think to the current state of diversity within literature?
Yeah, so it's not kind of my exact field, but it is improving as well. Kind of statistics show kind of reports that go out about kind of the reflecting the reality. I think there's some work done by Penguin on Lit in Colour and the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education. So situation is improving, but there's still a gap. So kind of still more to do in terms of the percentage of children from different backgrounds that are in our school system and the percentage of books that actually reflect them. There's a gulf still between that, but there are more kind of initiatives and more progress being made in kind of getting authors from different backgrounds from kind of to allow them to publish their work, to kind of for that to be received, for children to kind of experience those books. So progress is being made, but there's still a gulf, and children are probably still more likely to encounter books from kind of a westernized perspective. And part of that is also about how in the publishing sphere at the moment, in the British publishing market, there's a very small percentage of books from other countries and cultures that are actually translated into English. So we have a big dominance of our own national literature, but there's not as much coming in. Sometimes the exchange goes more the other way. We see some of kind of the children's classics like Alice and The Wind in the Willows being translated in lots of different languages, but we don't always get that in. And kind of the classics from other countries and cultures being translated for British children.
So what do you think to how our literature, from the Western world, being imported into different countries? Because I suppose for them, that's their diversity, but that's their version of diversity, I guess, like for them to have sort of outside literature coming into their country. What do you think to that?
I mean, it's difficult because a lot of people had highlighted that particularly British children's classics, a country's classics, often it's not just about the language that's used. Sometimes it's the social and cultural aspects of culture that come through in those books. And it's been repeatedly highlighted that actually a lot of the changes that would be needed to translate some of these books into other cultures, sometimes kind of some of the original text is lost in that sense. When you translate, you always create a new work that is linked to the original, but it's not quite the original. And that's not always as kind of problematic. With classics, maybe it is a little bit more so, because we're saying with classics we value them for the quality and the literary aspects, but those can be the things that get changed in translation. And even more problematic maybe is the practice of abridging, which is the idea when you take kind of a children's book and you reduce it, you cut it down. And that's often something that happens, particularly in classics, and because of this idea that we need to make books suitable or appropriate for children, and that the original work is too complex in a way. So that's a common trend. If you were to go into a bookshop and look for maybe examples of, let's say, The Wind in the Willows, you might find lots of different versions that abridge the original text to varying degrees. And that can be from kind of a few minor amendments all the way through to it was 5,000 words and it's now 50. A little board book, right? And that's I find that really interesting. Kind of when's the point at it? It's still a classic, because by title, it's got the same title, it's got the same characters, but there's so much that's not there as well. And there's no definitive point at which we can say, okay, that is still a classic, that isn't a classic. But those books will be marketed as a classic, but they're very different from the original text.
So when it comes to sort of I guess like this is what it is in terms of a lot of the kind of literature world is commercialized, you know, and children are consumers. What would you say is the happy medium for, you know, for us, you know, who we already have this situation? What would be something that you feel like, you know, this would be as good as it gets?
Well, this is a way forward kind of over. So I think it's about this kind of commercial context exists. You know, it's part of a broader kind of social context. We see it in kind of terms of adults, kind of films and literature as well. And I think it's more about how we navigate it, and it's about adopting a critical approach to what is out there as well, in terms of the kind of books that are being encountered, in terms of kind of toys and products as well. So it's kind of looking a little bit beyond brands and marketing campaigns as well, and thinking about kind of what is actually behind that.
But how do we do that, Nick? And especially when you want to bring in children as, like, you know, to have ownership, agency, you know, in that discussion. But it's obviously not going to be easy, or maybe even possible, to have them really heavily involved in the discussion and what happens.
And so that's kind of where maybe it is at the level of the adults, but a lot of people have huge brand awareness. There's lots of studies that show that you can show people logos and they instinctively know which brand it is, kind of what campaign as well, like that. It's almost subliminal. We kind of interpret a lot of information about brands from our everyday life and things that are playing in the background on TVs as well. So it consumes us in a way. And as I said, it's hard to go backwards in terms of kind of going back to an age when there was less products and kind of less kind of different versions of things as well. So I'd say it's maybe kind of the role of kind of the adults to mediate that for children, and to kind of think about what's being presented to children as well. And, you know, thinking in terms of books, about maybe books they'd recommend, or kind of the educators would recommend, separate from a brand. So look at items maybe divorced of the branding that they accompany.
So from a practical point of view, how do we really kind of give children a bit more power when it comes to allowing them to have more agency? How do we actually do it?
Well, there's kind of a few different levels. That would be kind of the biggest level. Obviously, it's kind of getting children involved in the products that are out there they create. So we talked briefly about kind of children being writers as well, children being creators of kind of apps and products as well, because that's quite like at the largest scale in terms of that. And kind of from that, kind of working within the framework that they've got in terms of different products, maybe it comes at the level of greater choice, allowing them to kind of choose more things that kind of they would like. And maybe it's also about kind of understanding a little more about what they like and their interests as well, and recognizing that what children position and like could be very different to what adults see as well. And just because a book is recommended might not mean that actually it'll be a favorite with that child. So it's about choice, it's about involvement, and it's also an appreciation of individualization, because brands are not just targeted at an individual child, they're targeted at all children as well. But individual children have things that interest them and that they like, and topics as well. And that's also important for gaining their enthusiasm in reading as well, finding out what children like and being able to kind of match them maybe to books that might interest them as well. So it's kind of navigating that large sphere to enable them to find things that interest them and that maybe they can then kind of become engaged with.
To what extent do you feel the education sector itself can help navigate, you know, what you talked about just now, in terms of making things a bit, you know, as you said, better? You know, what can we do as educators, basically?
So I think, I mean, part of it, and Teresa Croman has written a lot about this, is teachers' knowledge of things like children's literature. And it's kind of being readers themselves, being critical consumers, or kind of people who are aware of this broader contextualization of kind of the commercial component and branding as well. And so it's that criticality in terms of the books that they bring into their classroom, the books that they recommend to children, and Cronin's research has showed that teachers who are readers and who know more books they're better placed to make good recommendations to children and to encourage kind of a critical approach towards books. So that's things like the diversity element, kind of recognising what books represent and also who they don't represent, and being able to kind of bring in examples from other countries and cultures as well that come into that. So it's knowledge of children's literature, and it's kind of a mix between acknowledging that books are part of a broader context, but being able to separate them from all the branding as well, and kind of focusing on maybe, let's say, kind of some of the literary elements in classes too. So I'd say it's kind of educators. Educators are the main asset in a classroom, I think, and teachers who like reading and are readers themselves and appreciate books can bring an awful lot to a classroom.
So how would you recommend somebody who's interested in this area, who's a practitioner, how would they be able to develop this kind of critical approach?
So the UKLA, the United Kingdom Literacy Association, is kind of an excellent association that's got lots of people involved in literacy research and a huge amount of resources for, let's say, teachers who want to just broaden their knowledge of children's literature, teachers that are interested but they don't know where to start as well. So that's part of it. And I think it's also it's important to be a reader yourself as well. So if you read books, then you're already engaging in some of that critical thing that we've talked about. You make choices, you reject some books but choose others. You might read a book and stop halfway through. You might look out for books that are similar like that. So maybe you always mirror what you would do with children in a classroom. So it's kind of part of your own identity, and then it's developing a particular knowledge of children's literature, like going into bookshops, kind of engaging with resources about kind of research on children's literature, keeping aware of new things that have been published. I mean, I often just go into children's bookshops and wander about and see what's out there, kind of what are the new directions that are being taken in, kind of what's interesting, and then the more you speak to people, you get recommendations from other kind of students, and then there's a lot to then kind of implement that in classrooms to create a classroom that kind of is a literature friendly classroom. There are former students who tell me about kind of the book corners they've created, how they've tried to embed reading into their school setting through having things like teachers recommending their own books, through developing libraries, through having class stories as well, all of that kind of broad language rich environment.
So from a personal perspective, what do you value in literature?
So I think it links to a point I made earlier. I value the use of language that's there, kind of the amazing different ways that authors write. I love the transportational element, that it transports me away to kind of a different world as well. It allows me to kind of enter worlds and experience lives that are far beyond my own too. So I think that part, not necessarily escapism, but experience, how it broadens horizons. I think important. Company as well. People often don't frame this one, but a book can be company too. It can be relaxation, it can be company, it can support kind of you to deal through different emotions as well. So there's a lot that I appreciate that a book can give back.
Okay, so when it comes to the commercial world being such a dominant force, if you like, in the literature world, what would you like to see happening in, say, like the next 10 years in terms of how that could be sort of transformed into something that you would like to see more of?
It's interesting because there might be some differences between what I think maybe you'd like to happen and what actually is more likely to happen. Because in the context that we are, when we talked about kind of the huge commercialization, it's a going onward trend and it's continuing. And it was the theorist Jack Zipes who talked about how what we have in an American context, at least, is what he terms the cultural homogenization. There are lots and lots of the same sorts of products and stories being retold again and again. And that's likely to continue, he says. And so Britain's more likely to see that Western trend as well, of lots of the same stories and products. In terms of what I'd like to see, maybe kind of greater diversity in the products that are out there, kind of maybe more involvement of kind of children in shaping kind of books that are produced and books that actually are shared with them too, but acknowledging that actually it's part of a huge commercial context and we still see today the same stories being retold again and again, alongside this growing trend of diversification that's trying to kind of catch up as well.
What are the opportunities with the, the current growth in the sector? Obviously, like, it's getting big because, of how children are all consumers now, and they're all buying more and more of those products. As things are, what do you see as opportunities that we can kind of use that to our advantage, if you like, to kind of make it better without, that kind of pushback from the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because actually, if you say about making kind of a product child friendly and appropriate, that's probably quite lucrative, because there is that side. And I mean, I'm talking about kind of publishing and marketing companies. I'm not meaning to kind of hugely criticize always that approach, because they come from different perspectives and motives. For example, in the publishing industry, a book has and always will be a product with a price. It's always going to have that commercial component. So to publishers and marketers, what's important is that product sells. That's maybe they're less kind of tied to maybe what educators might see concerns about the quality of books as well. So there is still that kind of separation between the two. And so I think the involvement of children and diversification of products would be something, in terms of books, that I'd hopefully think could maybe develop further. But there's always going to be an existence of books and products out there for children, and so it's just learning to navigate that. I think. Okay.
If anybody's really interested in this particular area, what would you recommend that they check out?
Right. So, in terms of things to check out, any kind of sources around. I'd recommend the work of Jack Zipes, actually. He's done a lot about particularly the proliferation of Harry Potter too. Philip Nell's written on that. There's also some kind of, if you're interested, I think one of the most important things you can also do is just see what's out there too. I mean, just go into bookshops, go and search online, see about the range of products that are out there, maybe even before you encounter the critical appreciation of those and reflection, because actually you'll be able to identify trends of what keeps kind of popping up, and particularly any people who have a connection to children, have children themselves, will be already part of this. You'll have participated in kind of the consumption of items too, and you'll be aware of it. So you see what's out there, and then maybe look at the work of people like Jack Zipes and Phil Nell, and Melanie Ramdarshan-Bold has written about kind of trends in the British publishing industry, particularly things like the growth of celebrity authors, and kind of issues around diversification as well.
Great. Cool. It's been so fascinating, actually. If you were to have to say one thing as a tip or suggestion or recommendation for practitioners out there who are trying to, I suppose, educate children using children's literature, what would that be?
Oh, just one tip. Okay, there's so much. So I would say, draw on as many different books as you can. Kind of range is important. We've said that kind of concepts of quality is important. So being discerning about the books you include, but find books on different topics, find books that represent different cultures as well, because maybe one of those books you select is perfect for a child at that moment. And that's actually a gateway for them into reading, or encourages their love as well. So read a lot, and bring all your reading and knowledge into the classroom.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Amy.